Welcome to Voices,
a podcast from the Institute for Human Rights and Business.
Here, we're seeking to elevate the range of perspectives
on the role of business in the world
and in people's everyday lives.
Hello, everyone. I'm Neil Wilkins, and welcome to this Voices podcast from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. My guest today is Archana Kotecha, who is speaking to us from Hong Kong. Archana is a barrister who, after time spent as a corporate lawyer in London, joined the UN Refugee Agency as part of their legal team before working with a variety of British-based anti-trafficking organisations. On moving to Hong Kong, Archana became regional head for Liberty Shared, again engaged in promoting measures to prevent trafficking and legal support for victims. She continues to be a strong advocate for the victims of trafficking and is recognised as a regional expert, regularly advising various ASEAN bodies and specialist interagency teams in different countries in the region. Today, we're going to be talking about her latest endeavour, the Remedy Project. Archana, welcome. We're going to be talking today about access to remedy for migrant workers, and remedy is clearly a vital but often forgotten pillar of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Why do you think that is?
Well, Neil, if I can start by saying this, that the importance of remedy is to address violations that have taken place and to almost put them right to the best extent possible. But it's also an opportunity to learn from mistakes and to address those. So traditionally, the focus has really been on criminal justice mechanisms that are actually severely hampered by fractured rule of law, retaliatory action against workers, and various other asymmetries of power. And access to remedy is also quite affected the further down you go supply chains where you have really small to medium-sized suppliers. Now, this really leaves the non-judicial mechanisms, typically the operational grievance mechanisms that are designed by companies as voluntary sort of measures in order to identify and remediate issues. Now, the operational grievance mechanisms are usually designed in a manner that does not always best serve the interests of workers. And therefore, it becomes, one of those, it's almost like dirty linen, where it's left in the back, it's left unattended to. It's one of those mechanisms that nobody really wants to pay much attention to because it actually brings out the worst of the worst in its sort of, running. And I guess, from a slightly different perspective, remedy is so intimately linked to due diligence. If your remediation system is not good, it shows that your due diligence system is not good. And at the same time, if your due diligence system is not good, your remediation system will suffer too. So, more recently, there's been so much focus on the ESG movement and on the protection and enforcement of labor rights in particular. This is really an opportunity to bring back remedial mechanisms, operational grievance mechanisms back on the table, because they're an integral part of not simply due diligence, but also respecting and managing labor rights.
And to aid this process, you've developed a set of guidance aimed at improving company business understanding of grievance and remedy for migrant workers and how this sort of practice might be improved. Perhaps you could just sort of outline the guidance methodology that you've been working on.
Sure. So, given that the design of remedial mechanisms falls within the voluntary measures deployed by a company to manage risks and remediate grievances, we actually felt the need to put out a comprehensive set of principles and outline a process that includes the bare minimum standards all the way through to the desirable and higher standards. This was in recognition of the fact that different actors, have access to different resources and different capacities, and actually nobody should be put out of the position of having even a bare standards minimum grievance mechanisms. We also wanted to create a resource that would be accessible to all. So whilst it carefully considers the company's need for practicality and efficiency, it actually has at its heart the enforcement and protection of migrant worker rights. And it's firmly rooted in the UN Guiding Principles 8 criteria for an effective remediation program as well.
And I noticed, well, the guidance outlines 7 particular steps in a process that could be undertaken by an organisation who wish to establish a remedy programme, and we'll look at those in a moment. However, going back to the point that you've just made, I notice in your guidance that there is an extra step. You actually start at step 0. Why have you done that, and what is it that needs to take place in advance?
Absolutely. And step 0 was perhaps the most fun to really think through. Step 0 is about building trust through the co-creation of the remediation program with the workers, their representatives, NGOs, and trade unions. I mean, workers are unlikely to use a mechanism that they do not trust and that does not take into account their specific vulnerabilities, their needs, and their issues. So this stage is also about education for workers on their rights and how the mechanism can actually be used to enforce and protect these rights. It's, and if carried out with integrity and care, step 0 then becomes a critical pathway to workers' effective engagement with the mechanism, as well as a platform, in a sense, for communication and advocacy with their employers. And I guess, from the perspective of trust creation and ownership of the remediation system by workers are absolutely critical for the mechanism to be impactful. And this is the reason why we have step 0.
And there's perfect feedback loop for companies and business as well. So, clearly the key to a successful remedy process, as you've just said, is the need for a sense of buy-in from workers. But the guidance then goes on to outline 7 steps that should form part of an effective process. We haven't really got time to go deeply into all of those steps, but perhaps you could just briefly give us an outline of what those 7 steps are now.
Sure, I'll just take you through a whistle-stop tour of the 7 steps. So step 0 we talked about is building trust. Step 1 is really about submitting and receiving the grievance. So making the referral pathways as clear and accessible as possible, with entry points being multiple and in languages of workers. Step 2 is really about verifying the grievance. So here, the need for clear, transparent internal procedures to verify the allegations. Step 3 is really about investigating and determining a response. And here, the need for clear, transparent internal procedures. So designating, identifying, or training personnel who are actually involved in investigations. It's really important at this stage to also have written guidance on the investigation process, to have a system of documenting and storing the decision, and of course, communicating the decision to the right parties. And, at this stage, it's very interesting to look at involving workers and external stakeholders in the investigations and verification process as well, as a way of creating further ownership and trust. Step 4 is about redressing the grievance. And here, in designing the remediation action plan, it really is about ensuring specific and satisfactory remedies. So the remedies would be applied fairly consistently in a non-discriminatory manner, engaging with workers in actually determining the remedy, and looking beyond compensation and repetition to non-repetition of the offense. And that goes into looking at the underlying corporate governance issues that might have actually given rise to the problem in the first place. The 5th step is really about implementing and monitoring the remediation. And here we're looking at, following up with the worker, making sure the appropriate documentation is in place, but also looking at different ways in which the remediation process itself could be improved in order to be more worker-friendly and to have more engaged stakeholders. Step 6 is about closing the incident with the appropriate record keeping. And step 7, which is really important, is about incorporating feedback and evaluating the results. So here you would have an assessment and evaluation of the actual results of the remediation. Were these satisfactory? Did they meet with expectations? Were there any challenges in actually creating the pathway or navigating the pathway? It involves a review and update of internal policies. Perhaps as an outcome of the remediation, some policies need to be changed, and communication of the outcome of the remediation to other workers, also very important, because that also helps to build trust. And adapting to the changes. So ensuring that, where company policies need to change, that there is a timeline given and that there is a window within which those changes need to take place. And those changes need to be very clearly communicated to the workers. And, I guess underpinning step 0 to step 7 are the fundamental principles of non-retaliation, non-discrimination, and confidentiality. And really throughout the principles, what we really try to do is to find ways and means of reducing the asymmetries of power between workers seeking to navigate the system and their employers.
Can you give us some examples of why that might be important?
Sure. So in some sectors generate particular, very specific vulnerabilities. So, for example, they have particular features, remoteness, very poor access to migrant workers, or the extensive use of subcontracting practices that would really necessitate careful consideration when designing a remediation system. So it's well and good to have your overall principles and to have an overall idea of what you need, but the tailoring and the customization and going back to step 0 and working with workers is really important. Also, the legal framework, access to courts or judicial mechanisms and legal remedies is also an important consideration when you're designing a non-judicial mechanism that is designed to complement the judicial mechanisms. Migration corridors and features of exploitation may vary, sometimes from sector to sector, from one jurisdiction to another. And again, these need to be carefully thought through when designing the mechanism. And referral networks and referral support and availability of services might also vary from one location to another and from one sector to another. And it's very important when designing the remediation mechanism where you may potentially need to refer someone for support. You would need to be very mindful of those when you're actually designing the mechanism and the different pathways as well.
Right. And Archana, finally, how do you want the steps that you've produced to be used? How do you want the guidance to be used? What are your plans to promote it?
I mean, we ideally like the guidelines to provide an important first step for companies to really evaluate potentially an existing program so that they could think about bettering it and perhaps build on existing steps. We also think it could be a useful tool for workers, for worker representatives to advocate for better standards in companies that they're already working for, that already have grievance mechanisms in place, but that are not particularly suited to the workers. We also think that for those considering putting in place a system, this could be very useful guidance in terms of the bare minimum and what they should be aiming for. And industry bodies that already have their own grievance mechanisms could perhaps benefit from looking at this with a view to raising their own standards in terms of what they're providing. In terms of what we plan to do to promote, as you know, this is a joint publication with IOM. So we've been engaging and we plan to do a lot more engagement with IOM Crest private sector clients in order to really get to a large cross-section of corporations. The guidelines are now on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center as well. We've conducted a number of stakeholder consultations and sharing and plan to do a few more in the near future, especially in Malaysia and across the sectors of palm oil and electronics. And we're actually in conversation with industry bodies in the relevant sectors as well in order to see what they can do to promote these standards alongside their own standards as well. So, it's a full agenda. And I guess from the part of the Remedy project, we have been working on building a remediation mechanism, which is actually a framework that brings to life all of these principles. And our wish will be to see that mechanism piloted in the near future in order to show that the principles that we've written about can actually really be, brought to life in remediation mechanisms.
Great. Archana, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really interesting, and we do hope that the guidance receives the attention it deserves, and more importantly, as you've suggested, is used by practitioners supporting those sort of seeking justice. You can find details of the guidance at the remedyproject.co, and we will also be putting a link to the guidance on the IHRB website. If you've enjoyed this IHRB Voices podcast, you may wish to subscribe to our feed, or you can sign up to our newsletter to receive all the latest news from the Institute and the world of business and human rights. Thank you very much for listening.